OG Rose, and today we have our first net session. This was a lot of fun on Thursday. I appreciate everyone who came out. I will probably continue to release these on the weekend. Not sure Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It will depend on work and different things. It also gives me a chance to say, fix the audio, edit out technical difficulties, stuff like that. But if there are any hard breaks in the audio, I'm sorry about that. I attempted to loudness normalize compressor as Audacity will let one, and hopefully that made things better. I also cut introductions. We talked to Matt as people gradually logged on, so the video will go straight to talking about people's works. And go from there. You will find information, links in the description to everyone's work who was there. I highly suggest going through and giving it a look. The paper on Bergson that I was reading that I brought up is called Bergson and the Holographic Theory of Mind by Stephen E. Robbins. I thought it was a great paper and I really enjoyed it. And you can find that online. And hopefully I did not butcher Bergson's thought too badly as I was discussing it. But anytime we maybe orbit a thought or orbit a work, I'll try to include that in the description as well. I think I'm going to not do comments on these videos. I like how the Stoa does that. They don't have comments on their videos. Obviously, there will still be comments for the OG Rose audio conversations or even those OG Rose conversations. But I think it would be nice to leave the comments off so that people can come in, talk, go, leave, and then not feel like it's a presentation. I feel like comments add to the feeling that it's a presentation. So anyway, I thought this was a lot of fun. I really appreciated everyone coming out. And without further ado, this is the first episode of The Net. Start asking you what you've been working on or what you've been thinking about. So like I said, Pei's doing a series on metaphysics, which is perfect. So I'm looking forward to that. Who I've met talking about, we had a conversation on Kafka, which was a real delight, talking about how kind of the way that Kafka operates is that the consciousness structures reality toward you in such a way that contributes to your own imprisonment, as opposed to say in where Huxley, they're using pleasure to control you, or maybe in Orwell, they're going to be using force to control you and different things, which I think is interesting because it can tie into Hegel's sort of notion that the very way that we are toward reality transforms in a ways that it is toward us. And actually, in an interesting way, you can think of Kafka talking about what happens to us if we're not structured as a becoming other. If we're actually kind of concealed in an A and A logic, that we end up just going deeper and deeper into the pathologies and neuroses that develop as a result of that. So that's always been fun to talk about.
The most recent things I've been thinking about, there are like two things that I expect to publish soon. Is the first one is how, in a way, what if we are disembodied, in the sense that, for example, of course, we are physical in the sense that our organs reside inside our bodies, but what if our conceptual psychological self exists outside our body? It's a like a weird thing to think through. So I'm still trying to develop it, but I think it has fascinating implications that say, and it doesn't have to be like in contradiction with materialism. It can be just like a emergent phenomena, but in a way, just of course our environment conditions us, but what if we take it to the extreme and say that our motivation, our desires, our fears, like everything that's not our strictly physical self exists or is caused, or the origin of that is external to our physical being, because normally the way we think about it is that environment influences us, like internally stuff happens and gets created and then we go out. But what if it's completely the other way around? What if it exists externally from us? So that's kind of an interesting I've been working on. So yeah, that's one of them.
Well, it makes me think a little bit about Mr. Frege's ontological design in some respects, and Mr. Jochen and I have been talking about. So, which has been interesting on the notion. Would you say that therefore the external environment we cannot say is hard separate from us, that we in some respects extend into the environment, and that functions as a feedback loop on how we think and operate?
Yeah, the way you think about it is also, of course, these distinctions are useful, but I love this example that when we go to school, like and they teach us the respiratory system. They teach us the nose, the lungs and stuff, but we couldn't breathe if like trees didn't exist. So like in a sense, it's like like we could say that our respiratory system involves trees. In a sense, we could think about that. So in a way, thinking of us like a distinct, separate thing of like everything else has implications. And if we think of ourselves, but it's really weird to think of ourselves as something external that from our physical body. It's just a really weird thing to wrap your head around. But I think it's in sometimes it makes a lot of sense, or at least it's a really interesting way of thinking about it and the implications it raises. Because like yeah, and some of these like of course are in a way like almost like seem logical, or like of course I can only desire to go watch the new Marvel movie because it exists. So that's like a pretty obvious thing that of course like your environment reflects or influences your desire in some way. But but like to take that a step further and say like my desire is the outside and originates in the outside, and I'm just kind of that channel that it flows through. Yeah, it's interesting.
I really like the whole thing that was being mentioned about like this notion of like the existence of like an external world to a sense. And from the psychoanalytic point, especially since I've been in my projects working on seminar one and kind of breaking it down, this notion of like, it's really hard to distinguish the difference between what Lacan would say, the in-world, the inner world of especially the unconscious, but also of the unwelt, the outside world. And especially his attack, or not necessarily attack, his like defense of Melanie Klein's object relations. We do, in a sense, get structured by the objects around us, but it's not like this naive realism as like the way things are in themselves, but as they appear, this representation, which has both fantasy, desire, and in a sense, desire has a material structure. So I think like everything that he said could be complemented with the psychoanalytic approach too, and I kind of find it fascinating too. And I would say like that's also a big part of my work, is seeing how not only desire is structured through what we could call the external world, the world that we're already absorbing or engaged in the Heideggerian sense, but also how it takes place in ideology. And one thing that I think is fascinating that I'm also trying to play on and really get the hang of is like, if you're not familiar with Lacan's Inverted Bouquet, and how it's just such a really interesting metaphor that he's using with this experiment of the optical schema, and that you never really see the actual vase. If there's a vase that's enclosed in this box, you just see the image of the flower, and then as the revolving, concave mirror comes about, then you get this virtual image of an actual flower sticking out of a vase. But what it's trying to say is that in some sense that the aligns so well with the material reality. So I wouldn't say that I'm like writing, or it's more of like I'm jotting down these ideas and trying to at least kind of come to a concrete understanding of not only how psychoanalytic, because I'm more focused on the clinical aspect and I do want to become a clinician, but also how does it function in the social reality in the Žižekian sense of ideology as something that comes into parallax view with the social reality as something as natural, but it's really not.
I think it's really well. I think it's really interesting because, as you said, like some of the things I mentioned, you look at them through like the psychoanalytical lens, and I think it's like it makes sense because it involves the mind and almost like and I find it interesting because we almost always find a ways to look at things through our own lenses. Because, for example, the lens I use is like metacognition, like thinking about thinking, like examining our cognition per se, like our cognition being not specifically psyche or something, but like the cognition itself. So we always filter through these things, and for example, to take this to an extreme, like for example, this is like very like it still makes sense that you can explain it with this is materialistic in the sense that it's not like spiritual or mystical or anything. But for example, there are people that believe that when you are born, the like astrology, like the how the stars were like formed when you were born affects like stuff in your life, and in a way that like that's, and it has like for them, or like the supposition is that they have a real impact on your life, even though it's like completely removed from your being and your something. So you can even like these are like similar conversations, but like in a way distinct. But because you can take like the more like psychoanalytical cognition route, but you can also take like the mystical way of saying like almost like your motivation, like a real metaphor. But your motivation is a tree, and if someone like a tree that exists somewhere in the world, and if they cut that tree, like you cease to have motivation. For example, something really weird and like something like that, or your desires is like a pearl in the bottom of the sea, and if that pearl gets crushed, like just as a kind of like fun thought experience, like imagine if you're like physical like cognition desires like psychology was tied to external things. I think that's also like really interesting. And for example, like astrology, like if your Venus was somewhere in your when you were born, like that affects something. So I don't think like well the first idea I think like is completely compatible with materialism, that you don't have to have like extra dimensional forces to explain. The second one like it would be, but I also find it interesting that it's that not always, but almost to answer any question, you have to grapple with how reality functions, because you say like, okay, if like psychoanalytical sense has like only makes sense if like all these like previous conditions are met. So yeah, I found like really interesting. You say like the base, like how interacts. But it's really interesting.
And it's more of like a dialectic, because it's a split between like what would be the outer world and the inner world. They both are like determining each other and negating each other.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Although it might be more like music in the fullest sense, because what we're talking about is not just, I mean, for reductionist sake, it's easier to consider two things opposed or in conjunction, but in reality, it's enormously complex, all the things that are intertwining. So this is kind of what I'm interested in, actually, is the intersection of philosophy and its application on understanding the practical ways in which we relate, certainly in semiotics and communication and all of that. What's happening here right now is really fascinating. Like, you guys are sharing some extraordinary ideas. You can see how the sharing is doing something to each of your psyches, right? Your biology. You're getting excited by things, or perhaps evolving some ideas. What is it that we're doing right here with regards to this notion of this like cybernetic intertwining of influences, these external and internal structures? That there's something really strange that happens when you become aware of the process itself, when you do that meta move. That's certainly the thing that we seem to be wrestling with mythopoetically, like the idea of consciousness coming into the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden, that kind of thing. So as I observe groups of people come together and make contact with each other, it's fascinating to me what it is it's actually taking place, what it is actually being sought underneath the exchange, right? What's propagating it, the motivational states, that kind of thing. By way of introduction, that's the kind of framing that I'm looking at. My name's Tyler. It's great to see you all.
Like, nice to meet you, Tyler. And for example, in a way, you view it more as like the way of like interaction between like persons. That's kind of view it, because that's another way of thinking about it. Like, of course, like in a way, like each person, if you think about it like as a cell of a higher organism, like let's say humanity, that's also another framework to view that you are not the center of it. And I think it's also a really interesting the implications of that are really fascinating, because you can see like, okay, like if a cell in my body like may feel free to do its thing, but it's really just working in conjunction with the whole entity that it's influenced by and stuff. So yeah, what you mentioned about interactions is really interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, so like dialectically, we could talk about like you and I exchanging right now, just going back and forth, but the total of this space, like what it all sounds like, so to speak, at once. That's what I meant by the musical analogy. It's and perhaps less of an analogy than we'd like. The whole thing's vibration anyways, right? So there is something about that. Like, what is it? What would it be like for the total interactions of this space to carry its kind of the total aesthetic quality? And so, like, and maybe you can just extend that out into all the transcendentals. How good, true, and beautiful can this set of interactions be at any given moment?
It's interesting that you bring this up, because I've been trying to get a hold on Bergson, who does, creative evolution and all these different people. Bergson is this name that you hear, just like kind of Whitehead or different people. And I'm like, I really need to go back and reread that guy, because apparently he's a big deal. And then I realized there's about 100 thinkers I need to go back and reread, because apparently they're big deals and I didn't get it the first time. But it's interesting because Bergson, he wants to say something like form is a product of time, not of space. So, for example, this table here seems like it's a product of space, but really it's more so of time. And he has this paper was put out talking about the holographic universe, where every point of the universe contains all the other points, and I cannot even try to explain it. So, I'm sorry. But what's funny is, Bergson kind of makes a point. He says, if you try to locate the now, you can't do it. You can get all the way to the Planck length and there is no now, right? Time doesn't even have a now, which is very strange, because if form is to be a product of space, you would need to be able to isolate time. And ultimately what he wants to say is that all points of time exist at all other points of time, and that the information of one is contained in the whole, and you can understand the whole you can only understand each part relative to the whole, that you can't break it apart. And do you know what metaphor he uses? Music. He's big on saying that it's all music, that the structure of the universe is actually a musicality. He also uses this language, and maybe someone else here knows more about it than I do, of process and event, where he wants to say that objects are more so events, and where when there's an event, it's almost like a musical harmony is hit. Like that's when in the process something arises. And that makes me think of, we can get, flow states, or when you're focusing, or when you have a really good conversation where there's a certain sort of harmony that breaks through, where it makes it feel like an event is really an event. And I'm really taken by Bergson. He's it's one of those thinkers. I know Javier wants to do something on Martin Buber, and I have a bunch of other books on my desk that I haven't read. But it's quite funny that y'all bring this up, because precisely with Bergson, you can't really divide. Everything kind of comes to every point contains the information of all other points. So a hard break between things and persons can't be done so easily, even if there is some degree of specification. Maybe someone else knows this. It seems like Bergson is big on not saying you can have distinction, even if you can have specification. Like, even if I can specify an object, I can't make it distinct from other objects, it's just a very fascinating ontology that he's presenting.
Well, I don't know. It's the first time I hear about him. He sounds really, really cool, and it reminds me of, in a way, of the movie Tenet, I believe, because it's about like time to travel, and I think it's and I don't know where I heard this, but I remember once I was like grappling with for example, with how what time is and stuff, because you could say like you always time is relative to the point of view of something. Like the past is only relative to this point in the future, and what you say that every moment is happening at the same time, it's really true, because in a way the future is happening right now, and I don't know. So I find that really, really fascinating, and and relating to events, but like when you see that every moment has the information of all of them, is that in a I don't know how to say, in a mystical kind of way, like every moment has the information of all the other points, or is it more just or it's more in the lines that you said, that I really like this, that there's specification, you can specify something, but you cannot really make the distinction, because everything is kind of the same substance in a way. But I don't know how would you think of describing it?
Now, this is where you're asking me for the technical details of something that I just read last night. And so this is the part where I can act like I can give you all that. But when I say it's like apparently with a hologram or whatever, it contains all the information. It's not like I don't think it's like a single, words like substance have a lot of weight in philosophy. I'm not sure if Bergson is saying that everything contains the same substance. It seems like there might be differences between information and substance. I'm not sure. But something that that comes, so again, if anyone here has technical insight into the brilliance of Mr. Bergson, please feel free to speak up. But what I find interesting about it is this notion that you can't have distinctions that we're talking about objects. Like Bethany had that great piece on the idea that during COVID, a lot of places that say you would go for healing, like a religious church or whatever, like they shut down. You're not allowed to go because of COVID. And what does that say about the nature of belief? You cannot help. Once you are in a world where, you know, the healing, like the church where you get a miraculous healing is shut down because you don't want to spread COVID, you know, think about that for a second. That reflects back on the nature of your beliefs in the world, right? And that makes you have to reflect on it and says something about the world that you are in. And so that kind of comes to mind how the music per se of how you operate in the world is inevitably affected and influenced by what is happening outside of it. Or then if you wake up one day as a bug, like with Kafka and the Metamorphosis or whatever, the entire world changes around you in response to the way you changed, and the possibilities that you can realize in that world simultaneously change because now you're a bug and you can't lift your arm to open a door. The day before you could lift your arm and open a door, but now you're in a place, you know, you're in a world where doors cannot be open. And so there is this very interesting feedback loop that I think back and forth, that it seems like for me, the notion of Bergson it seems like it can overlay on the notion that even if you can specify, it's not so easy to draw distinctions between the person and the you know, and objects in the world, precisely because you have that kind of feedback loop that's going back and forth to one another. So I kind of avoided your question on the specifics of what Mr. Bergson means. So, you know, hopefully a few Kafka references got me out of that. But I will hopefully come back to you because I would like to really, I hear him brought up so much that I would like to get a better hold on his thinking.
Well, I mean, to kind of do a little zoom back meta on what we're talking about, like what Tyler said, you know, maybe to reset the conversation. It is interesting, right? The pretense here was just, Daniel, you were just like, hey guys, I'm doing this thing. We had no pre-knowledge of who was going to be in this room together, nor it wasn't like there was a set agenda to what we're going to do. And you know, nothing alive really, there's a kind of deadness when things are pre-planned, right? Versus the aliveness when something's unscripted. Also, I'm reminded too of, you know, in Aristotle's ethics, wit is a virtue. Wit is a kind of intellectual virtue. And I think that kind of levity and kind of funness and aliveness is part of a good intellectual discourse too, right? So I think even just not even coming in with a pre-planned expectation and kind of seeing what emerges as very much an event. As you can see, I'm trying to like circumnavigate what we all said together. Because remember, in Greek, there's chronos, where that time, the sense of time is two certain terms. There's chronos, which is that kind of circular, continuous time, and there's kairos, like kind of moments. So when I'm hearing about events and objects of events related in time, I'm thinking of kairos, explicit moments. And even goodness itself is contingent on it, because there's statements in the ethics about it. The goodness of an act it's also contingent on the right time, just as much on all the other attributes, which I always find a very fun acknowledgement by Aristotle. So
But that's a good example because the towardness that one brings into a space transforms the nature of the space, right? Like it isn't, say, aconsequential, the nature of the subject of the music per se, or the instrument that the person is playing as they walk into a space. These things are indeed informing one another. And like you kind of say, if you don't have a preset agenda, you can get an element of surprise that makes things possible that otherwise would not be possible. And that's where, you know, if we have a kind of classical, very hard materialistic view of the world, you know, that should not really matter. You know, if you have X object that has, you know, B characteristics, that should not really shift relative to the environment you put on because you only have material factors that are at play. But really, like you say, you have these elements of the particular subject that is running into this space, the particular emotional space that they go into. And really what's interesting is it would seem to me that today, there's increasingly an awareness of that subject design, not just architectural design, that maybe has to especially be explored online. as you know, if we're trying to be meta, that one could say we're doing here at the net, because there is a certain logistical limit that one is encountering when it comes to the internet. Say, for example, with buildings, I can add ramps, I can add basements, I can add swimming pools, I can add pool tables, I can add an area for my children to play Legos for 5 hours, which, you know, there are all these different options that one can bring. But what's interesting with the online space is I can't really add a pool to my computer. I can't say add a Lego center for us all to go to. You basically have a microphone, you maybe have a video camera, and maybe some different fancy sound effects, or you can have a blurry background. You know, I've never used this before, so this is an entirely different environment. But it's interesting that within those kind of set parameters, one has to look for new processes in events, which seems like a unique logistical challenge. I don't know what others may think of that, as opposed to, say, in the world where, say, I could have a house on a farm, I could have it in a city, I can have different locations of which the terrain itself brings with it different atmospheres, whereas it seems more limited with the net.
I have an observation piggybacking off of that in terms of like built environment and then online environment. As everything shifted to exist online in the last 2 years, what was interesting is that there's a lot of like virtual spaces that indulge like the fantastical element. Like you have these spaces where you can interact as an avatar that is not a picture of yourself, or you can choose to like have anything in your virtual environment. Anybody can like be interacting on the internet as their virtual selves. What ended up happening during COVID, and not necessarily like, I'm not really talking about like when people were carrying on their business, but when people started having, like they put their film festivals or their exhibitions online, everything mirrored the real world. Like they wanted to have, if they had a panel discussion, they would put people's avatars like sitting in chairs. If they could, like if they had an online environment where you could have visual elements like that, like they would build like a classroom or a conference room and everybody would be sitting in there. When in reality, or in the virtual reality, you could have like had a panel discussion underwater. Everybody could have been mermaids, and like everybody could have been like walking around as something, like you could have been in Atlantis or like outer space, and nobody had their stuff. Like everybody tried to mirror. I'm not really sure what tangential point I'm trying to make related to that, but it's very interesting that you don't have the same possibilities in the virtual world that you would in the real built environment, but you also don't have to mirror your built environment to the online world. And I wonder why people did that.
And especially on that last point, when she was mentioning about the virtual world and all these reoccurring themes that we've been talking about, like complexity, time, I'm getting a lot of like Deleuzian vibes, and I wouldn't say I'm an expert in Deleuze as far as like difference and repetition, but I would say I have more of comfortability with like the Deleuze of like Anti-Oedipus and Thousand Plateaus. But this whole thing of like how we could come together, of course, we're not sitting, face to face. We're not in the quote unquote flesh in the real world. And yet at the same time, the virtual has been an apparatus of capture. It's been like a new territoriality of a way of engaging in the real world, where the virtual takes on the codes and the characteristics of the latter and create a different complexity, whether for bad or for worse. Some would say like the virtual reality is like a simulacrum that's like a fake, like these reactionary points of view of like how like technology is like and like the way it affects people in the social world. But you see others that see it in more like not positivistic, but a line of potential, a line of difference. And I think that with that, like even in the sense of like how it seems all of us, I don't know if everybody or some of you are academics. I'm not an academic, I've never been to college besides just a couple of classes that I've taken. I'm in the military, but the fact that there seems to be more engagement, more dialogue, more exchange of discourse of different ideas, from epistemology to aesthetics to politics to psychoanalysis, in a way that you couldn't get from the traditional apparatus of the institutions. And it's like everything's become, in a sense, rhizomatic, but there's still kind of this like acknowledgement of a contextual hierarchy, but it's not like a instantiation. Like I may not know a lot about Kafka or like Daniel or Paydu, but in a sense, the more I learn, the more it's like I'm not keeping that like subject supposed to know to them, or me being the subject supposed to know of Kafka. I could then take on a new territoriality and code of Kafka in my work in some ways that, you know, a Kafka fanboy or like what I would call a LARPer that just wants to like, you know, keep this traditional preservation of Kafka. But no, what lines of flight can we take? What kind of minor literature can we create?
Well, I mean, I instantly thought, I mean, Bethany brought a great point. I mean, I'm thinking of skeuomorphism in design. Basically, we have a natural instinct that anytime we transfer mediums, we tend to just copy what we have from the past. We have like kind of domain blindness. You know, the first Bibles printed were exact copies of traditional Bibles that were made in Germany at the time. Et cetera, et cetera. The first websites were newspapers. We're literally like New York Times. Remember, the New York Times, when it first got published, was like on the website, was exactly a copy of the print edition on the web in like 1992, whatever that was. So there's a very strong natural human tradition in design in any kind of spaces where we deal with the digital. There's an instinct to just skeuomorphize and just. And I really do appreciate this idea, Bethany, of the like, why not be in Atlantis with a mermaid? Like this lack of imagination is like deafening the way you painted that picture. I think that's very telling. I just wanted to share that note.
I was sort of thinking about this question of process and event and how Bethany was talking about, you know, I really realize getting disrupted. One of the things that I do in my sort of work, anthropological work, ethnographic work, is that we've been trying to think about how does event operate in the everyday life. That's one of the problems that we've been trying to think about. And what we found was that there's a commonsensical thinking, if you think in process and event terms, so there is everyday life and then there's an event. That is how you usually think about, isn't it? That every life gets disrupted and then you get an event. What you actually find when you actually do work with people on an everyday basis is that usually event erupts from within the everyday itself. It doesn't come from necessarily simply, you know, as a break in the everyday. In fact, every day usually constructs itself around numerous events, you know. And initially, when we started thinking about this question, I think the idea was that the very contours of habit, and that's where I'm coming back to what Bethany was saying, that our habits generally are formed in. We have a very negative view of habits in some senses. The habit is something which is routine, which is in which you're not thinking, in which you're not caring, which are almost automatic, and so on and so forth. But if you start observing people in everyday life, for instance, there's this anthropologist Meena Das, whom I'm really inspired by. She writes about this example. There is a woman, you know, who makes tea for 5 people every day. You know, she goes and sits in the room, 5 people, they're having a discussion, and this woman will come and make tea for them. And it's as part of her own habit, she'll always knows or asks how much sugar everybody will take. That form of care, that form of love is part of that everyday life that she's connected with, and that structures that event of the discussion each time. For instance, that work is in our case is done by Oji Rose, Daniel, in that sense, you know. So we might take this background in which the discussion is for granted, but it's in that background itself that an event takes place that seeps into our everyday discussion, and it's true that something transforms. And of course, one can argue that not all events are like that. COVID is one such event where a break is so stark that we need to create new everyday rules. We need to create a new space against which certain events can take place. You know, and the struggle is that in what ways can we find a new background? You know, I think Hegel already had it in his thinking that there has to be a background against which something has to take place. You know, you can't be creative without any background formal rules. There is always a background of rules against which certain form of thinking happens. You know, the struggle is to create that background again. And of course, when you're struggling with that background, you're always trying to create a background which is more familiar to you, which is more, you know, given to you, and so on and so forth.
Really funny what Bethany's saying, because he's exactly right. Like, as you get into these online spaces, you could be a mermaid underwater, you could do all of these different things, and yet we just tend to replicate real life, which just goes to show you how prone we are when we're given new opportunities or new spaces to do different things, we just fall back on the old. It makes me think in some respects the difficulty of actual speculative thinking, like you mentioned Hegel. Like it's actually incredibly difficult to engage in real speculative reasoning because we're so stuck into what the patterns that came before, and breaking out of that is so important. And I see Mr. Ebert just showed. Mr. Ebert, good to see you today, my friend. I hope you're doing well. I love what you said at VoiceCraft the other day about how we tend to define our life according to the things that have the most duration, as opposed to these, you know, we kind of have a bias to assume that if it has more time, or if it more defines what we usually do, it is more real. Whereas, you know, these moments of, say, radical unity in a concert, or radical unity in a conversation, why can't those be the defining moments of our lives, or things that we kind of take as significant? And it's very interesting that we have this tendency to ascribe more reality to longer durations, in the same way that we have a tendency to ascribe to what we're used to as almost subconsciously being what we're then going to represent online. And it's very interesting how we have those sort of tendencies and have to work out of them. So I really like what you were saying the other day, Mr. Ebert. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, this is fun. I'm in the middle of trying to finish that paper.
Nice.
That I owe you. Me and Chitan are probably sweating bullets right now, even being here. We need to be writing right now. But you know, what you're saying is, I think, most perfectly exemplified in the relationship that didn't work out. Because it didn't last, or what are we even talking about when we say that? Because it didn't go forever, it didn't work out. Yeah, it's I think that really undercuts the duration that we do have here. In that case, life isn't working out because we're all going to die. So we need to just realize that each of these moments are these things that have, you know, it's very, of course, it's very Hegelian, because that's all I can think about right now. But, you know, in Science of Logic, it's like the reason why mathematics is broken is because mathematics is supposed to represent values as a ratio of quantity to quality. And that because mathematics leaves out the quality, mathematics is this erroneous, sort of like emaciated form of thought. And I think we could apply the same thing to what you're saying. It's like, if we're just going to base everything on quantity of time, and that's our success metric, and we're going to leave out quality, which is in many ways the actual denominator. If there's a relationship there, quality is the larger portion. Because, for instance, my childhood, all I remember are these like really specific qualitative moments. I don't remember the duration of sitting in a lobby waiting for my mom to get out of the doctor's office. I remember the moment when I saw the rubber ducky, you know, hit the wall and I laughed. I don't remember all the in-between shit. And that's because the reality of our operational memory maintains that qualitative component. And yet as adults, we start to just like negate that. And I think especially as philosophers, we tend to just be like, well, the things that aren't last are imaginary. They're not real. You know, and you're being childish, actually, right? Because the idea of wanting to return to a one in which we feel safe and sublated with the mother, and we feel unified, and we have those moments at a concert, that's childish. Well, yeah, our childish math is better than our adult math because we're including the qualitative components. So anyway, good to be here.
Well, first off, you don't need to sweat bullets about your paper because you're writing a book, apparently, on Hegelian mathematics, as long as it is right now. No, you must. I would love to read that because I think the angle that you're bringing to Hegel is fascinating. So I appreciate that. No, it's interesting because I actually, Mr. Ebert, earlier I was talking about, I've been reading up on Bergson because it's one of those people that I don't know extremely well. And I'm embarrassed to say I don't know extremely well because people always talk about Mr. Bergson. And, you know, we play that game of hoping it doesn't come up in conversation. But what's fascinating is where he, you know, as you know, he'll talk about process and event. And the big thing he also talks about is look at the structure of memory. Like, look how memory operates. It operates in concordance more like you're saying. It does not say give. We don't tend to remember duration. We tend to remember these kind of punctuations. And similarly, it makes me think about with Mr. Pei on how we don't really care what Gregor was doing before the metamorphosis, right? We only really care about when he wakes up as a bug. That's what makes the story, right? Where there's kind of a structure to story of which inherently is going to be centering on these particular defining moments. And yet what's so interesting, it's so difficult, it seems, for us to actually operating according to defining moments, precisely because there seems to be at least some subconscious tendency, just like Bethany was saying, that as soon as we get the internet, rather than explore new possibilities and try to create communities where we're mermaids underwater, she was given a great example, instead we just replicate real life. And we try to do avatars where we're sitting in chairs. So there's this bias toward duration, this bias toward regularity, this bias toward those kind of things that we then give the most weight, which perhaps causes, well, in one sense, it makes sense because we might go crazy if we didn't have some sense of regularity, right? You know, like it would be difficult to know what you could operate according to. But at the same time, it also seems to become a problem because it stifles our ability to think anew, to think creatively, to go in new directions because we give such bias toward duration and regularity.
The premise of trust is almost a combination of both those two things, you know? Redundancy is we build all of our trust structure on redundancy, you know, so that's.
But then why isn't duration then just a really natural way to consider the continuation of the qualitative events in the world that we have ordered in such a way that we just want to keep associating with them? It seems like a really natural move to make, to move into duration as, well, so we can talk about like how it breaks down in particular ways. The felt sense that our will has utter control over how long a thing persists is a kind of a compositional element of that. But the purity of this idea of, well, appreciation, right? I don't see how we can escape duration being some way to assign a value landscape to all of these qualitative events, because I only have a finite amount of time to be alive. Therefore, the qualitative things that I appreciate in my lifetime, I wish to have the most duration with, right? So that seems like I'm trying to figure out how to get a way out of that move, but this is fundamentally probably the thing that gets explored in Eastern religions, right? Like, so being separated and being unfulfilled and feeling emptiness, right? Like we can do all sorts of fancy tricks to prevent that negative state from occurring. Or we can also anesthetize that negative state, which is a common one now. We have a lot of fancy drugs for that.
I think that Eastern move has a third option, which is to see the sort of nothingness of everything, or the everythingness of nothing, or vice versa. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form, such that the empty space that would be interpreted as boredom or as just like duration turns into this sort of sumptuous affair of saturated experience that is actually responsible for creating the sense of nothingness to begin with. That it's so saturated that we experience it as nothing. And there's that sort of mental trick, form is emptiness, emptiness form, Heart Sutra sort of thing, that can turn duration itself into this incredibly satisfying, washing the dishes becomes this very beautiful sort of space. But I think from the Western point of view anyway, the idea is that we collect enough, or we collect an amalgam or a composition of these moments of quality. And so we look back on our life like, not did I have enough duration of quality, but did I have enough moments? Did I do the things I wanted to do and whatnot? So it's a different mind frame, but yeah.
Bethany brought up an interesting point in the chat there with David Hume on this notion that a great work of, there's something about great art that also lasts. And there's also, Chichan is saying that, you know, one of the problems with COVID is precisely that it took people out of their regularity, that they didn't have a background that they could kind of understand, and that how that led to so many, you know, mental, you know, it threw people off a lot. So it's interesting where, you know, for me, since I'm always obsessed with tragedy, like the fragility of goodness, Martha Nussbaum, where she talks about a tragedy as a trade-off of competing goods, you know, like you look at Sophocles, you either have to serve your family or serve the gods, you know, what are you going to do? You can only pick one or the other, like, you know, and what Nussbaum really wants to stress is that democracies are in a lot of trouble because they've lost that category of tragedy. So they think in terms of problems and solutions, when really much of life is trade-offs. You can, you know, if you get more freedom, well, you might get, you know, less protection, or you might have, who knows what's going to happen, or you could have more of something else and lose something, but you can't have both. So it's interesting to think that there seems to be, dare I say, a sweet spot. You know, this is the move where I go for the middle, and, you know, everyone loves to make that move. But it seems like what's interesting is that we need enough regularity in order to have a sense of ability to conceptualize or to understand. But then what the problem is, it's almost like it's very difficult for us, and if I'm not using this term correctly, somebody correct me, of overfitting. I think in computer science, we talk about overfitting, where we tend to overfit a model, and then we kind of take it too far, where it seems to be a tendency to overfit regularity and then lose these kind of glimmers or glimpses. You know, Mr. Jockin and I with Javier, we did that, a philosophy of glimpses, to really stress these moments that more glimmer as being very philosophically significant, where if we lose that and we're in trouble, it makes me wonder if, to what Bethany is saying, if the reason why some of these great works of art last is precisely because they are the most reliable to provide these moments of emotional power, or these moments of glimmers, where it's interesting, where the things that kind of last the test of time are precisely that can provide these, can reliably provide moments that are these kind of powerful moments that you can't durate beyond that. I'm wondering if there might be
baked
something
into
there
nature.
with
It's
that.
quite clear, right? Decay is everywhere. Even protons and neutrons decay over orders of who knows how long, billions of years. But there's something within that for sure. But when we're talking about our relation to it, there's two sets of decay, right? There's the external and the internal decay. That reflective, you know, reciprocal relationship, which is some inner representational state in accordance with, you know, some state out there. Now, they both are subject to decay, right? So if I turn away from some stimulus for long enough, it, you know, it will disappear and fade over time. Or if I'm fixated on some living thing in the exterior world and it has a decay rate, it will eventually disappear. And then likewise, so will mine over time, fade, because it no longer has that stimulus. Now, the things that we do to try to make something in the external world persist are usually the destruction of other things which are persisting in order to make some new thing which makes that persist. And that's when I look out on the grand stage, like that it's some weird like transactional voodoo of the life drive and the death drive doing some strange dance there, because you're like vacuuming up life from elsewhere in order to preserve it in one singular location. Now, I think just to tie it to this meta again, what occurs with us right now is this fixation. We get fixated on screens, we get fixated on points, we get fixated on solutions and maps and all this stuff. The stronger the signal, the more likely that is to happen. And the less likely we are able to explore other options. And I think that's a nod to the necessity of ephemerality. It's either imposed at some point, or I don't know, I like to incorporate some kind of memento mori in almost everything I do.
Well, interesting to the point that Chitan made, is like the sense of background regularity is also, because the other thing that Hume talks about too is that there's, or I think that he points to, is that he's always pointing to the fact that patterns in physics and in the natural world are sort of assumed, and it is that assumption that allows us to continue living, like the assumption that the law of gravity is always going to be a law, things like that. And so he points to that, like the value of regularity the value of duration. I mean, and that's why the standard of taste talks about this too, is like if human life has to adhere to regularity and assume that there's going to be a durational pattern, then everything follows from that, and aesthetic value follows from that as well.
Was there a difference between the regularity of something alive and the regularity of something that's like that's not alive, I guess, to be quite general? You know, because like, for example, there's you get married, right? You know, there's a regularity of the commitment, but your wife is not the same or you're not the same. So there's a change. So yes, there's a kind of regularity, but it's also not a stagnant regularity. Whereas say when I, you know, worked at the wholesale and you're going, yeah, it's not the exact same every day, but it's weird. It actually does kind of feel the same every day, even though it's not, you know, it's not literally the same carnations are laid on the truck, and it's not literally the same roses that happen, but there's a kind of regularity that makes it feel more stagnant. That, interesting enough, I definitely felt the ability to just, oh, I'll just do this for 30 years. Like that ability to do that, which would actually be potentially problematic. So it's interesting because there seems to be some sort of difference that I might have to think about quite a bit, but you know, between this kind of regularity of something alive and regularity that's not so much alive, and then regularity of something that's not alive at all. I wonder if that changes the schema a bit.
Basically, then we coming to the question that the problem is not regularity itself, it's what kind of regularity we have. You know, we always need a regularity for events to take place. Then the question becomes different, the direction that you're taking, Daniel. You know, so then the problem is not that COVID disrupted and the regularity broke down and we're creating regularity again. That's a good thing. We need to create a regularity again. The question is, what kind of regularities we are creating? That in life might be one kind of distinction. Although my own sense is that I don't think regularities in themselves can be dead or alive. There has to be something else happening there which we need to think about, because one can also, of course, think certain regularities which have become completely which have gone completely into the background in some senses, you know, on which we have no control over. They become oppressive upon us, they become violent upon us, and so on and so forth. But my own sense is that even those regularities which become violent in that sense, they aren't necessarily dead. They aren't necessarily in that sense, you know. They are very, very active. They are very, very. They have a lot of impact upon you, and so on and so forth. So how do we think through that? You know, I think it's an open question. I would love to see how other people would, you know, respond to it.
Yeah. So the way I see that is an interesting ratio, right? And we all kind of start off as animists in a sense, like that. There's this sense of everything that's moving having its own kind of inner sense of motivation, in the same way that we move because we have some kind of motivation. It's an instant recognition. But there's this weird thing, like when you connect with something outside yourself in the world and you have an intention upon it, the difference between the subjective and objective seems to be how much of the ratio of will I'm granting to that thing. So if I come at it thinking that it is like me, a subjective entity that's able to make different decisions in the world, and I try to interact with it, there's a component of me that's saying, I'm going to do something, but I don't know if what I want is going to happen because there is some amount of will in that thing. A purely material response to that is I hold all of the will within me in order to make it do what I wish it to do. And there's like various amounts of that we can sense into, right? With regards to the way that we struggle against will, the way we consider things morally, like animals or humans, how much will they have or understanding. Yeah, so that's how I see it. It's like it's kind of a spectrum. And of course that depends upon my own sense of capacity in that regard as well. I can only measure the depth to which my own metric is capable.
Tan, I think that there's two things. One is that I think in the macro sense, perhaps there's objective dysregulation from COVID, but in the micro sense, what actually occurred was extremely monotonous. And the extreme monotony was itself extreme regularity. And if we were to take sort of the idea of Hegel and the idea of sublation as this sort of process of a compacting regularity that increasingly approaches infinite self-relation, to the point where suddenly there's a collapse and something else sort of occurs. I know that I experienced that myself during COVID. And that regularity has this transcendent quality, such that, you know, you're putting the flowers on the bed every day, and then eventually sort of, you know, the act itself sort of transcends itself if you do it with enough regularity, that you become, I don't know, a master of putting flowers on a truck of a bed, or whatever the case is. Or you get, the other case is you get totally sick of it, and it explodes into a dysregulation that then, you know, needs to put itself back together again. But yeah, I just wanted to touch on the duration thing again and just say, I don't think that, and the regularity thing, I don't think, for me, I'm not inclined to prioritize duration on any level. I'm just sort of like, I think that skews, I don't see how you can have a philosophy or develop a philosophy that isn't sort of tainted with your own desires. In that sense, and personally, I don't find that desire to be integral to who I am. I actually really like when things end. I find it challenging and difficult emotionally, but I find it very, you know, like manure. So, yeah, I think that we could take duration out of the loop altogether and just see more qualitatively, like what occurs, what's valuable. And if we can view the moments as just as valuable as anything else, and then approach measure and approach that ratio from that context and see what's really valuable to us. Yeah, because, you know, ultimately, if we're not concerned with duration, we will act less extractively, because we'll be less concerned with our own personal duration. We'll be less concerned with making something work and these sorts of things, and less, I think, approaching things less extractively. There's a flip side to that, where you're approaching things more extractively, like what can I get out of this moment? And if I can't get anything else, I'm moving on. So there's always a flip side to these things, but yeah, I'm inclined to just sort of toss duration. I find that I fall into traps whenever I try and extend things beyond their moment.
Yeah, something stuck out to me there is the question of whether we can separate philosophies from our desire. There's this concept of sort of embodied values, right? And it's almost as if with our actions, which I kind of agree with what David Hume might say here, are very much so largely, or at least there's a question of whether these are completely a product of our desire. And then I guess that's kind of a question I have for you guys. I'll just keep it brief. Is like, do you think that ultimately our philosophical judgments are just expressions of their evolutionary or mental?
Well, that would actually tie, and then I'll give it to Mr. Jochen with what Mr. Ebert is saying about quality, because if you see something as quality, is that a reflection of desire? And then we'd say, well, desire is not inherently bad. You know, desire can be good and desire is inescapable. So then there's questions of the cultivation of desire, which I do like this idea of focusing on quality. Y'all all know that I'm obsessed with intrinsic motivation and how that transforms towardness toward the world and how that affects desire. But I always greatly appreciate the incorporation of Mr. Hume. If everyone, Mr. Barnes wrote a tremendous book called Missing Axioms, I highly suggest. And he has another one coming out on the iconoclast. So, you know, the iconoclast will have some Hume in it. So I appreciate it.
I can, sorry to interrupt. I can show you a surprise if you're interested.
Oh, do it. Isn't it your book bag?
I'm currently just going through the first proof right now.
Nice.
So there you go.
Nice. Well
There'll
done.
Be a second proof. There needs some corrections, but yeah.
I look forward to it. And Mr. Jochen, what were you going to say, my friend?
Oh, just the kind of circle back on the original, I think the original thread of this conversation on the background of creativity. You know, it's funny. I'll say this because we had a lot of different dimensions here. I think it was actually a very fun little discourse I'm hearing right now. I really appreciate it. But the first part is, it does seem like we've had a conversation of regularity. It's a question of kind of epistemology, in the sense that we know that, at least for humans, when we have things that are basically we're blocking out a mass amount of information from our perception. What actually gets cognized and we're becoming aware of is very much a very small percentage of the amount of information coming into our senses. Mainly, so it seems like our priority is to shut out the noise of existence as much as possible. Actually, so it's almost as if, generally everyone seems to be making a comment that, always I've heard from other people, that existence is self-imposed, that we, as our consciousness, we're posing existence onto things. Although it seems almost more strong, I would argue, that we impose nothingness on things. When we say nothings, we say that nothings exist, that nothings, we can knock out the world, say, "Bill doesn't exist." I look out to the field and say, "Oh, there's nothing there." Well, that's not true at all. There's lots there. It's just not relevant to me. So thus, it's nothing to me in that moment. Just like that, things that are regular, we think of not relevant, not interesting, not worth engagement. So what Alex is commenting on about washing dishes, for example, something that's monotonous we do all the time. Maybe the key, I just kind of share the note that maybe the key of wisdom in some cases is to understand the infiniteness of those moments, of the natural instinct to absolve from the regular, the norm, the real existence and value of those things. But with that said, I also am thinking of things like from Nassim Taleb, the Lundy effect. We do know that, and in fact, civilizations generally carry on information from generation to generation, and things that persist over time, although on a civilizational level, is information. So this seems to point out that duration does matter immensely as information when it comes to culture, as transfer through civilization. So that tends to be the tension, and we need that because we would not exist without that. So maybe that's an issue of scale. And then last note, because the issue too, because of creativity, right? You can come up with a bunch of wild ideas, but if it's not has usefulness, doesn't have fittingness to the circumstance of the conversation or the engagement, then it's not useful. It doesn't carry on. So that seems to be the tension of why we need things like metaphors and analogies. We need these devices that carry something alien or new in a new context, something else. So we have a tension. We want regularity, consistency, and norms over time to survive as they exist. But because reality doesn't actually stay the same, maybe that's an imposed reality we put on things. We need inventiveness that creativity gives us. Or as I love what Shitan said about the background for creativity. I wrote a grammar for creativity that needs to be added in. It's always in the background of engagements.
Oh, I just wanted to double tap on that. Claude Shannon, like information theory, the whole concept is, yeah, okay, so that's what you're pointing at, is this idea that what we're actually seeing, we're not positing, but rather we're negating the noise around it so that we're creating a noise to floor ratio such that things end up presenting themselves as such. And it's sort of this idea, the word is not informational constriction. It's something almost identical to that that's eluding me right now. But yeah, this idea that what we see in that existence is actually a process of negating the totality such that only particularities come forth is such a beautiful concept. And it again dovetails into what we're talking about, where if we were to take in everything, we would see nothing. Because there's quantum noise, there's all of this, we would be seeing the string theory, we would be seeing, all the invisible particles we have to negate in order to have things come forth. And it's a beautiful concept, yeah.
I was just adding to, Thomas and even Alex in that sense that if you look at it, there's an example that Zizek gives, I think, somewhere. But if you look at language, language is a pattern of rules. If you've not acquired a grammar, you can't speak. Those grammatical rules you might not even know. Like you might not know why gerunds are nouns, or you might not know why a verb like give takes two objects, and so on and so forth. We might not know them, but we've acquired those rules in the background, thus we can speak. If we do not have those rules in the background, we can't speak at all. And then if you want to extend this problem further into what Alex is saying, and you start thinking about it, and you add a twist to that question of noise, and you add negativity over there. The problem of, say, intention in Kant or Deleuze, or negativity in Hegel in that sense, which is that the problem is that you do not get the outside world simply as it is. You can never get it. there's there's a constitutive gap over there, which is already filled by your own consciousness, even before you externalize something. You can see that is why duration is such a difficult question, because duration is not just a question of time, it's a question of continuity. How do you create continuity between different things? You know, and that's why it's such a complex problem, and I think it's a brilliant question that Evert is raising for us. But essentially the problem is that we do not get the outside world simply therein. That space that something outside creates for us is already filled by something from within, and then something gets visible to you. It's in that horizon that something becomes visible to you. It's never as it is that you can experience it. That's the problem of self-consciousness in Hegel in some sense. And how do we think through that question seriously, I think, is a fascinating one. You know?
Well, even psychologically, either we're in a state of certainty and regularity, or we are in a state of uncertainty and irregularity. Both of those have duration, right? And if we have a preference for either one, we're preferencing a duration in that state. So it's just self-defeating all the way down, I think, because if we're talking about anything at all with regards to preference, which is it's like it's duration baked in. Right, continued contact or continued choosing of. It's a selection criteria.
But some thoughts that are interesting to me, just thinking through, you know, if we kind of say that we can't really define things apart or distinguish, we can only specify. And also we take the Bergson notion that it's very difficult to even locate where time is because there's not really a now, which is quite curious. It is interesting to think in terms of quality, you know, the quality of experience as opposed to the length of experience. I think it's a good point, Tyler, that the moment I use a word, I'm using duration, that I'm using time. So it's kind of difficult to escape, and it seems like it has something to do with quality. But again, this is a thought that I'm considering as we're speaking. But then the question becomes, what are the criteria of quality? What do we mean when we say something has quality? Why? Is it to us? You know, for what reason? There's some interesting questions there.
Like a meta point, if you will, it's really interesting because almost if I'm mistaken, you can all correct me, but it's almost in a way we haven't verbalized the objective of the frame of reference, because for example we talk about all these concepts and like for example duration in time is like useful, but I always think about it in the terms of is it useful? And useful, obviously, like we can always go down definitions, rabbit holes, but for example, the duration of something, and so like what framework or what objective or what's the intention in a way of saying thread, because in a way, for example, if it's just like the for example, if the objective is to experience more goodness or beauty in the life, then it becomes a relevant discussion about like, you know, duration or not. That, but I just found it fascinating that it's always like, for me, I've thought like I always filter things through the sense that, for example, maybe sometimes it's really confusing. Like we cannot put a limit on what it is and what we are. But I'm thinking like, is that useful in the sense that it helps make me live a more beautiful, good life? That's because if not, it doesn't. For me at least, it doesn't really matter like the specifics and distinctions of something. It's only in how it can be used and useful. That's the framework that I view like the topics. But I just found it interesting that and beautiful conversation. Thank you all. It was really lovely. Yeah, just like to verbalize the specific like framework, because like of course duration is important, or for example, depending on the objective or the intention of the subject, for in a way. Yeah.
I just want to thank everybody. This is such a great time. I mean, isn't it fun? We just get together on a Zoom call, and then, as we said, kind of throw it in improvised style. We have, my brain is buzzing. I have a lot to think about. I wrote notes copiously. Everyone's conversation, I really appreciate it. Alex, I'm glad you're a Chen fan as well. I actually was reading his a couple months, so I think I'll close on that note, which is the tension. I want to positive tension. I want to meditate on myself. Right, is the concept of Bayesian surprise. So by that surprise, this is very much is literally this kind of informing, right, of a moment. And I need to meditate on that, right? Because then there's a moment that then dissipates and goes away. Because as that thing was once surprising, no longer becomes surprising. But this is, I want to meditate more on that. And I think especially, right, I was thinking about moments. Memory, I think of moments of seeing something beautiful. It doesn't not have an individual striking moment, right? This kind of luminous striking of something beautiful, a landscape, a painting, something like that. Or even stories, by the way, narratives and icons and stories, these things that strike at us and cut right through our souls, and they kind of surprise and kind of draw us out of the mundane normalcy of things. Because I want to just close on that note. I think we had a hint of talking about that earlier in the conversation. So again, it's really great. I really enjoyed this a lot. It's a lot of fun. I'm glad I pulled over to take this call, and thank everybody. Thank you, Dana, for organizing, everybody for their conversation. It's really great.
I like that he brought up sunsets. It sort of dovetails into what I was going to say. It's like, you know, sunsets are really beautiful. I used to cry every time the sun set because the sun was setting. It won't keep setting. It sets. And that transience is the very thing that lends it the weight of poetry. It's what transforms I think maybe we wouldn't even have a sense of what beauty was if duration was never truncated. And I guess that's primarily what I'm sort of pointing at, is that yes, we can attempt to sort of want to continue to experience the sun setting, but it will set. We can want to continue to experience our life as living, but we will die. And that there is yet also what maybe Thomas or Emilio was saying is that if we have in mind the idea maybe of a duration of acceptance, something like this, that can allow us to experience the end of durations and move through them, continuing to be accepting of the sunset, of the darkness, of the dawn, and this sort of duration of acceptance, or a duration of something that is flush with the transience of life, such that we get to experience life in all of its sort of unfoldings. That's a duration that I actively seek within myself, like the duration of my acceptance of change, right? So these are the sort of the things that that help me in my life on a regular basis. That, you know, I apply every fucking morning when I wake up. So I just wanted to say that, and I suppose that would be my preference in terms of the thing that Tyler's pointing to, is I'm trying to choose acceptance and a vivid embrace of the moment, you know.
Beautiful, Mr. Ebert. Anyone else would like to say anything? I'll count to 3. 1, 2.
I just say thank you, Daniel. It was
Oh,
wonderful.
thank you to 10. This was the night. Well, like I said, we're going to do this on Thursdays. It's just a great way. I love all of you, and a way to see you and speak with you. I really appreciate how everyone came, how they carried themselves, the points everyone brought in. We will continue to do this, and like I said, I think Sam at Greener Side of Sam put it well, as a coffee house vibe. Come, go, step in. I really appreciate it. So thank all of you, and we will see you again, and I'll get you the recording, and I really appreciate it. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate it very much.